We want to move on to hearing from Henry Brady. He is a graduate from MIT. He's now he's been president of a number of major organizations. He ran the Institute of Survey Studies, so he knows. He is the world expert on this, on what surveys are about. He may be giving us a bit of a comeuppance in our methodology, but he is someone we wanted to hear from. It's very important to hear his perspective. So please join me in welcoming Henry Brady.
Thanks. So I was driving home about several months ago, and I was listening to the radio, and it was the Will Durst and Willie Brown show. Oh, and there was some guy on that show talking about computers and government and the importance of getting this right, and I kept trying to figure out, who the hell is this guy? And I finally realized it was Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, and I must admit it was a wonderful show listening to what you were talking about, and I was really fascinated by it. Even when I got home, I stayed.
I didn't know anyone listens to that damn show.
Well, a couple ex-mayors. Actually, it took me a minute to figure out who the people were. Willie, I figured out pretty soon, Willie Brown. Then I figured Will Durst. You came last, I apologize, but nevertheless, they're very distinctive, let us say. As are you. So I want to talk a little bit about democracy, and so this is going to take us back to basics a little bit, but I think it's worth doing that here. First thing I want to mention is innovation is important. I'm thrilled with what the team is doing here. I think it's really exciting. Congratulations, guys. I'm really impressed with what you've done, so thank you. I also want to mention that, unfortunately, though, most innovations fail, and that's been true through the history of democracy. So democracy is like any other area where there have been innovations that have failed. And so let's be aware of that. And let's be aware of how hard it is to design better democratic institutions. So I want to talk about the basic institutional design problem, just very briefly. So the question that theorists from Aristotle to Adam Smith to Karl Marx and many, many other people have been trying to ask for centuries has been, how do we design good institutions that really provide economic benefits and political benefits in the way we want them to. And the two basic things that turn out to be important are, we got to get information, and we got to get incentives to do the right thing, and that includes incentives to get the right information. So in economic systems, and some of this is cut off, markets, prices, and budget constraints do a relatively good job of combining information and incentives. Capitalism actually works pretty darn well. Central planning does not. Witness the Soviet Union, which unfortunately Mr. Putin seems to want to have back, which is not going to be good. What can we say about democracy? Well, here we want to get information on what problems need to be solved, and we want to have incentives to get government decision makers to do the right thing. Also, though, incentives for individuals to take the time and trouble to express the information they have about what their concerns are, what their problems are, what their interests are. So democratic systems are like economic systems. They're a mechanism by which we try to get information, aggregate it, and then have the right set of incentives so that the problems we have are solved in some sensible fashion. And economic systems do that pretty well. Democracies turn out to be a little more complicated. And so I just to talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms we have, and you can probably just from that list see that some of them are flawed in some ways. By the way, dictatorship's more flawed, so let's not go there. It's like central planning. It isn't a good idea. I could go on at length about that. Let me just talk about types of democracy very quickly. There's been a little bit of loose talk here about these various forms of democracy, and I want to be careful to really use definitions carefully. Like deliberative democracy really requires more than people just saying something. It requires actually interchange between people and among people. So Athenian democracy, New England town halls. The problem with these is they're very hard to scale. Now, maybe the internet will make it possible to do more of this. I'm not convinced yet. I'm going to come across as a skeptic here. Then there's good old populist democracy, which we love here in the state of California, in which we have the initiative, the referendum, the recall. The problem with this is that, I'll show you in a minute, people don't know enough about the issues by and large actually to make particularly good decisions. So what we've come to as sort of a mechanism that might work is representative democracy and advisory mechanisms so representatives can get information and therefore really try to solve problems that are real instead of problems that may be manufactured in some fashion. But it turns out it's even hard to make that work. And one of the reasons is people. Unfortunately, people have low level of knowledge about politics. There's not any incentives to spend a lot of time learning about politics. Most people don't learn much about politics, don't know much about politics. I'll show you in a minute that that's absolutely true. Ken showed you a little bit at the beginning. Partisanship has a big effect on attitudes. I'll show you a little bit about that. There's low levels of political participation. Problems are especially severe for lower socioeconomic status, which I'm really worried about, and I'll say how that gets to the California report card. And then the internet doesn't necessarily solve these problems, and I'll show you some data on that. So let me show you some data. Problem of low information and information bias by partisanship. Here's a question that we asked in 1991, but the answers would be the same today. We asked people, what's a bigger program for the federal government, Social Security or NASA? Now, it turns out there's almost 2 orders of magnitude difference. Social Security is about $1 trillion. NASA is about $10 billion. It's not quite right, but close enough. I've got the actual figures right there. So this is the percentage of people. Along the bottom, I've got 5 quintiles. At the left is the lowest socioeconomic quintile. That's poor people with low incomes and low education. And at the right, I have people with high education and high incomes. And the good news is once you get to the top quintile, 50% of the people know that Social Security is a bigger program than NASA. At the bottom quintiles, you're less than 20%. This is a really easy question if you know anything about government, and people get it dead wrong. Okay, so let's look at another thing. This is a model that's been developed by Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels, some political scientists, one at Princeton, one at Vanderbilt. And what they try to do is unpack the following things. When people answer questions, they sometimes guess, they sometimes use their partisanship to come up with answers, and they sometimes actually know something about reality. So this was a question about Clinton's reduction of the budget deficit from 1993 to 96. And the correct answer to the question was Clinton reduced the budget deficit over that period. So he was very successful at that. And this shows you how much that was affected by reality. Roughly, you can sort of look at this as the percentage of people who really had reality right. That's not quite what it is. It's a weight, actually, between 0 and 1. But good enough to just take it as the percentage of people who really sort of got it right. The answer is almost nobody got it right. Now, one answer might be is they confused the deficit and the debt, because actually the deficit was going down, but it was still a deficit. Therefore, the debt was going up. So maybe that's what's going on. So this is pretty discouraging. And across the bottom is quintiles of political information. So the people at the right are the people with the highest political information based upon a whole set of questions, like the NASA Social Security question. So it turns out even high information people didn't really have much of a grasp of reality here. Now the next slide shows you how much the answer was affected by their partisanship. And what you see here is partisanship becomes very important as you get towards the middle of the scale and drops off as you get towards the end. In other words, for really high information people, reality encroaches. For people at the middle, partisanship does most of the work. And for people at the bottom, the truth is they don't have a clue. They don't have partisanship. They don't have information. So I could give you another example about Clinton's economic performance, but I'm going to skip it because it's also disconcerting. Now, there's also the problem of low political participation by socioeconomic status. And this came out as I moved from Microsoft to Apple, but so there's some oddity. But these are each quintile of socioeconomic status and the percent who vote over time. So along the bottom, we've got 52 to 2008. And what you see is about 50% of the people at the lowest quintile vote and about 90% at the highest quintile. So one of the things we find in politics is the people at the highest quintile socioeconomic status, the richest, the best educated, they voted at a very high rate. The people at the lowest quintile voted at a much lower rate. By the way, this is from surveys, and it probably overemphasizes turnout because people, when they answer this question, tend to exaggerate sometimes. Let me just show you one more thing, which is distribution of political input percentage from SES quintiles. So again, I'm saying, where does the money come from, where do the votes come from, and where do the hours devoted to politics come from? So we actually had a questionnaire where we asked them, how many hours do you engage in politics, how many dollars do you give to politics, and do you vote? And so the one on the left is essentially like what I showed you a moment ago, which shows that, yeah, the highest fifth vote, they're 26% of the votes, but the lowest fifth is 14% of the votes. So the lowest 20% gives you 14% of the votes. That's not too terrible. But now go over to dollars, by the way. The lowest fifth, the poorest people, are less than 1% of the total dollars that are given. The highest quintile are 70% of the dollars that are given. And actually, if you go up, you'll find that it's really a very small group of people who give the money. So American politics, you've got to really worry about whose voice is being heard based upon the dollars they give. By the way, ours are in between, which is one reason to maybe favor policies that try to reduce dollars and increase political participation in terms of time and effort. I'm going to skip that one too. So what does the internet do? Let me just describe this and not go into this. Is the lowest to highest quintile. It's percentage active. And if you look at that for a little while, what you'll see is it says this. We did a survey where we asked people what they did online, and we asked what they did in person or through the telephone or through more standard old-time, old-style kinds of political participation. And then we looked at how participation varied by SES quintile. And first you notice all those lines go up, including the one which is the final, let's see, the bottom one, which is any online act. And indeed, that one is steeper, if anything. What is that saying? That's saying that people who are on the internet are even more disproportionately the rich and the well-educated. By the way, if I did this by age, you'd get also the phenomenon they tend to be young. So one of the things you've got to worry about is you're selecting, no doubt, with the California Political Report, the young people and high SES. I'm sure of that. And just showing that the marginals match, which is what you did before, is not enough. I really want to see some information on the income of those people or the education of the people who actually use the device and also their age. So what does this mean? It means we must worry about the quality of the information, first of all. Probably better when it represents people's concerns instead of their policy preferences. By this I mean the following. I believe that even the most uninformed person knows his or her problems and concerns. And I believe very strongly that politicians need to listen to those people and don't listen enough because they're not exposed enough to those people, partly because they're out doing fundraisers with rich people who tell them their problems. But and I think it's important to have mechanisms whereby we absolutely make sure we hear the problems and concerns of those people. Now, I don't necessarily believe they have very good policy ideas, because it turns out policies are really complicated and it's hard to know how to solve your problem. I'm not even sure rich and well-educated people have good policy ideas either, but that's another story. But at least we should know their problems and concerns. Second, I think it's really important to worry about the impact of partisanship on assessments, and I think that's another thing I wish the report card actually asked about was people's partisanship. Because, for example, Obamacare. It said most people in California think Obamacare is a good idea. That's not what you're going to get with polling data. A lot of people in the Central Valley think it's a pretty lousy idea. A lot of conservatives in this state who are not thrilled with Obamacare. We also must worry, by the way, about question wording. Notice the question about K through 12 asked about quality, and the question about higher education asked about affordability. Well, if you'd asked about quality of higher education, I bet you'd get really positive results. You ask about affordability, you're going to get what you got, which is not such good feelings about affordability given that tuition has gone up for the publics in the last 5-10 years because of budget cuts. And so it's really important to ask the right questions. And then finally, we really must worry about who's responding and how representative they are of the overall population. I'm deeply worried about the fact that this may be a lot of young people, a lot of rich and well-educated people. I'm also worried about gaming and capture. Lobbyists aren't foolish. If this becomes a mechanism by which people in government start to try to assess what the issues are, lobbyists are going to start saying, hey, go fill out that report card and tell them that our issue is the most important issue. So somehow somebody's got to think about this strategic use of this and how to reduce the degree to which it's captured by special interests. That's a big problem in America. That's what lobbyists do. That's what they spend lots of time and effort doing. So one of the virtues, by the way, of the standard public opinion poll is the selection of respondents is controlled by the person doing the public opinion poll. Decides who he or she is going to interview. That's not true of this technique. and we have to think about how we're going to control for the possibility that it could lead to biases. So I'm sorry to be maybe a little bit concerned about this. I'm thrilled with the innovation, by the way. I really think democracy needs innovations. We've got to find out new ways to do what we're doing and make it better. But I also believe that most innovations are going to fail, and that it's going to be really hard to solve this problem, which a lot of smart people through at least 2,500 years have not been able to completely solve. Thanks.